we as a team weren't too used to a design document. It's not that we don't want one, it's that we believed very strongly in just playing something and feeling if it, like if the design document said Aladdin jumps half his body height, that might be helpful, but does that feel good? And so we would go, yeah, no, it doesn't feel right.
There were elements of the design document, if I went back and looked at it, that I think made it in the game. A large percentage didn't, because it just evolved.
And so everything was tuned based upon what we just thought felt right. And so then the level starts getting laid out based on the limitations of the device. So whatever the design said, we're going to have some repetition of things because that's just how the platforms work. The game ended up building itself based upon what felt good or what fit and we could squeeze into the device.
We were designing on the fly and Disney was approving it or not approving it or giving input. So it was an organic process.
The biggest challenge to program a game like Aladdin is actually to get Aladdin, the character, to fit into the console when you have potentially thousands of frames. How could you ever do that? The way a video game console worked back then is you would draw a box around that character and that whole thing would get stored. So Aladdin was actually the worst case designed character ever because it's a person with a big long sword. And when you hold out the sword, it makes a box like this big because you got Aladdin and the sword doing this. And so it caused us really to think very hard, how could you possibly crunch all these big giant characters into the game?
The real breakthrough was Dave's sprite system, which could take non-square characters and break it down into little parts.
My tools engineer, Andy Astor, he made a tool for us that basically just did the most amazing job of cutting out all the bits that weren't necessary and also looking for any little bits that were the same. So if Aladdin's ear didn't move between two frames, it would actually save that part and we'd reuse the ear from previously. And so there was this sort of massively clever compression going on.
And no one had really done that before, so we could have big stretchy frames of animation.
Making it possible to have larger shapes that could change shape on the screen rather than just saying, hey, this is like a 4x4 sprite.
I personally spent a lot of time early on in the project working with Dave to figure out how we were going to get these drawings down to these sprites with giant pixels in them, have it still have that sub-pixel movement and still look like the animation.
I think I remember seeing the very early, Aladdin like run cycle and that up on Dave's machine, and it was just in black and white pencil still, and seeing, you could just see it was just so fluid. We'd never seen anything quite like this before.
Eventually we got to the point where it worked.
Games were very horizontal and vertical before, and we had lots of slopes and angles.
Yeah, it didn't require straight lines. Well, you actually had a tile set that would actually build these little lines and would have different angles of these tiles, which would be the thing that the character would walk along. And so we could build different angles, make them go up, and
you could make some one way as well, so you could you walk on it, but you could jump back up through it.
Yes, this was my method. Is like I would take some element of the game, and I just draw that on my monitor, and then we had to make tiles that were 8x8s. And then you could build those into larger tiles that were 2 of those tiles in each direction. That's right, isn't it? Yeah. So that would be a 16x16 tile. And from there, they were then used to build the actual levels themselves.
When I would look at some of the art that was going to be based on the level art, I would look at whatever I thought was the highlight piece, and I go, okay, I'm just going to start right there, and I'm going to burn a bunch of tiles, like a third of my tile set, to get that one piece looking great, and then try and stretch out.
Yeah, and then you try and use bits of that one piece.
But I wanted to make sure I had
a
strong center piece to the level that you go, oh, that looks just like the movie.
It was also interesting in Aladdin, there's one thing I talk about quite often, is how people play video games, they just want to be entertained. And so we worried a lot about the story of Aladdin. Is it going to be important that we tell the story? And in reality, the kids already know the story, but so there's a whole argument, do we really have to tell the story? And we, of course, agreed in the end, yes, we have to tell the Aladdin story. So we had this scrolling once upon a time thing. We tested it with the kids, and it was so funny because we're watching a room full of kids, and all you see is the thumbs going,
click, click,
play the game,
we don't
play
care,
the game.
we don't care.
I don't want to read any of this.
Yeah, but we just spent a week making this beautiful thing.
There was one girl in the room who sat and read all this stuff, and we pulled her out and said, why did you read all this, why did you read the story? And she goes, because I thought it would say something important and it didn't, and I'm really annoyed. So,
it's just the story. They're setting it up.
so it's a very interesting point, because there's a discussion on whether video games should be, more about
Narrative.
stories and more about gameplay. I think it was pretty clear at that point in the industry, it was all about the gameplay. Sound is way more important than most teams are ever willing to admit.
This is one thing that Dave really fought for. Audio actually took up the most space of these cartridges. And so if you wanted more memory on your cartridge, oh, well, that's $3 more per cartridge. And so they never gave music guys anything. But what Dave would do is he would say to me, look, Tommy, pretend you didn't have any restrictions. What could you get the Sega Genesis to sound like? So me and Dave, we used priority. We were doing things that no one had ever done before. And then Dave, again, to his credit, he would take that to the president of the company, Martin, and say, hey, look, guys, if you spent that extra $3 or $4, look what we could get this to sound like. Disney gave me all of these scores, these massive conductor scores and sheet music. This is a score written for the movie that had maybe 72 players. Now I only had 6 voices, 6 monophonic voices in the Genesis. And so it was very difficult to take these big scores and kind of putting them like this. So I had to go out and hire a dude, remember his name was Donald Griffin, to take all these massive scores. And then I would get back a MIDI file that had everything broken down, and I would have to then go in that MIDI file and start hacking and doing all my little tricks that I would kind of perfected in the Genesis over the years. The sound chip in the Sega Genesis it's called FM synthesis. It's a synthesizer from the 80s. It was actually a Yamaha chip that they used in the DX7. So it was this really kind of punchy, synthy, had lots of beefy low-end kind of stuff. For an orchestral score like Aladdin, a challenge for me was, okay, I might be able to write a tune, or I'd get that MIDI file of everything arranged, but now I got to get this thing to sound like an oboe. Oh my God, how do I get a wow to sound like an oboe? So I would sit there for literally days at a time, days, to come up and tweak all of the different things within the chip to get it to sound as close to an oboe as I possibly could.
At the time, everything sounded very digital in the game industry. You would think of a note as being off or on.
Yeah.
And,
Beep, boop, boop,
it's
beep,
on or off.
beep,
Bing,
boop,
bing, bing.
beep.
He would go in there and hand edit
Yeah.
each strike, say for on a drum, to be just a little
Just a
different.
little off.
Just a little different, just so it
Yeah.
sounded softer and real.
The easy thing to do would just be to quantize everything so it was exactly
Yeah. Boom, boom,
on the
boom.
beat, but it didn't have human feel.
Yeah.
And so the only way to get that human feel was to go in and literally tweak
touch it.
every single number and listen and tweak again.
I definitely appreciated the work that was getting done. There's no question. Sometimes he would come in, it would blow me away. I'd be like, how are you doing this? Okay, that sounds like a real electric guitar. And he's like, it is.